The gunshot echoed across the plains as Grace Reynolds raced through the darkness, her heart pounding like a drum against her ribs. The hem of her dress was torn and muddy, her blonde hair falling loose from its pins as she fled the saloon where everything had gone so terribly wrong. She hadn't meant to witness the murder, hadn't meant to lock eyes with the killer across the smoky room. But she had, and now she was running for her life. Montana Territory, 1876, was unforgiving to those who found themselves on the wrong side of powerful men. Grace had come west 6 months ago to take a position as a schoolteacher in the growing town of Pine Ridge, hoping to escape the confines of her restrictive life back east. Now, as she stumbled through the night, she wondered if she'd live to see morning. The distant sound of horses spurred her forward. They were coming for her. Her lungs burned as she pushed harder, the scattered lights of homesteads appearing in the distance. She needed somewhere to hide, somewhere they wouldn't think to look for her. The outline of the Galloway ranch loomed ahead, a beacon in the darkness. Grace had met the owner, Russell Galloway, only once at a town gathering. He'd seemed decent enough, but she knew little about him beyond his reputation as a fair and hard-working rancher. What she did know was that his sprawling barn might provide the sanctuary she desperately needed. Grace slipped through the fence, careful to leave no trace of her passing. The barn door creaked softly as she eased it open, closing it behind her with trembling hands. The warm, earthy scent of hay and livestock enveloped her as her eyes adjusted to the deeper darkness within. A ladder leading to the hayloft caught her attention. Perfect. She climbed quickly, wincing as each rung groaned beneath her weight. Once in the loft, she burrowed into the sweet-smelling hay, creating a hollow where she could hide while maintaining a view of the barn below. The voices came first, then the glow of lanterns sweeping across the property. Grace pressed herself deeper into the hay, one hand clamped over her mouth to quiet her ragged breathing. Tears leaked from the corners of her eyes as she heard men calling her name, their tones menacing rather than concerned. "Check the barn," a harsh voice ordered. The barn door swung open and light flooded the space below. Grace's heart nearly stopped. 2 men entered, holding lanterns high, their free hands resting on pistols at their hips. She recognized them immediately, the Blackburn brothers, hired guns who did the dirty work for James Wilkes, the wealthy mine owner whose partner she'd seen gunned down just hours ago. "She ain't here," the taller one said after a cursory search of the ground level. "What about up there?" His companion gestured toward the hayloft. "Nah, she wouldn't have time to climb up there. Besides, a city girl like that probably ran straight back to town." The men laughed, and Grace held her breath until they departed. Only when the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance did she allow herself to exhale. She was safe, at least for now. But dawn would bring new dangers, and she had nowhere to go. Exhaustion washed over her in waves. The terror, the running, the desperate scramble for safety had drained what little strength she had left. Despite her best efforts to remain alert, her eyelids grew heavy and sleep claimed her. Hours passed in fitful slumber. Dreams of gunfire and pursuit plagued her rest, causing her to stir and shift in her hiding place. When a rooster crowed somewhere in the distance, Grace startled awake, momentarily disoriented by her surroundings. Morning light streamed through the cracks in the barn walls, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. She could hear activity outside the sounds of a ranch awakening. Men's voices, the neighing of horses, the clatter of tools. She remained hidden, afraid to reveal herself even in daylight. The day stretched endlessly. Grace's stomach growled with hunger, her throat parched with thirst, yet she dared not leave her sanctuary. Occasionally, ranch hands would enter the barn, leading horses out to pasture or retrieving tools, but none ventured up to the hayloft. As twilight descended once more, Grace's hopes sank with the sun. How long could she hide here? What would she do when hunger and thirst forced her from hiding? Where could she go that Wilkes and his men wouldn't find her? The barn quieted as evening fell. Most of the ranch hands had departed for their quarters, and the livestock settled for the night. Grace shifted uncomfortably in her nest of hay, her muscles stiff from remaining in one position for so long. She heard the barn door open again and froze. Heavy footsteps crossed the wooden floor below, followed by the soft glow of a lantern. This wasn't a hurried visit to retrieve a forgotten item. Someone was taking their time, moving deliberately through the barn. "Hello," a deep voice called out. "Is someone in here?" Grace held her breath. Had she made a noise? Had someone seen her enter the barn the night before? The footsteps paused beneath the hayloft, and the light grew brighter. "I know someone's up there. I can hear you breathing." Terror gripped her anew. She could run, but where? There was no escape from the hayloft except down the ladder, directly into the path of whoever stood below. The ladder creaked as someone began to climb. Grace pressed herself against the far wall of the loft, hay clinging to her hair and dress. She was trapped. A broad-shouldered figure emerged at the top of the ladder, lantern held high. In its glow, Grace recognized the rugged features of Russell Galloway. His dark hair fell across his forehead, and concern etched lines around his eyes. "Miss Reynolds," surprise colored his voice as he recognized her. Grace couldn't speak, fear closing her throat. Russell climbed fully into the loft, setting his lantern down carefully. "Are you hurt?" he asked, keeping his distance as though afraid of frightening her further. She shook her head, finding her voice at last. "No, I'm sorry for trespassing." "I didn't know where else to go." His expression softened. "You've been hiding up here all night and day, haven't you?" Grace nodded, fighting back tears of exhaustion and relief at being discovered by someone who didn't immediately threaten her. Russell moved closer, crouching down to her level. "You can rest now," he said gently. "You're safe here." Those simple words broke the dam of her composure. Tears streamed down her face as she explained what she'd witnessed in town, how she'd fled for her life, how she'd had nowhere else to turn. Russell listened without interruption, his face growing increasingly grave. When she finished, he nodded once, decisively. "You did the right thing coming here," he said. "Wilkes and his men won't set foot on my property if they know what's good for them." "But they'll keep looking for me," Grace whispered. "They can't afford to let me testify about what I saw. Then we'll make sure they don't find you." Russell extended his hand to her. "Come on, you need food, water, and a proper place to sleep. We'll figure out the rest tomorrow." Grace hesitated only a moment before placing her hand in his. His palm was calloused but warm, his grip firm and reassuring as he helped her to her feet. "Thank you," she murmured, suddenly aware of her disheveled appearance. "Don't thank me yet," he replied with a wry smile. "Harboring a witness against James Wilkes is likely to bring trouble to my doorstep, but I've never been one to shy away from doing what's right." He led her down the ladder and across the barn floor, pausing at the door to check that the way was clear before guiding her toward the main house. The ranch was quiet, with only a few lights glowing in the bunkhouse where the hands slept. The ranch house was modest but well built, its interior warm and inviting after the cold night in the barn. Russell showed her to a small washroom where she could clean up, providing her with a set of clothes that had belonged to his younger sister who had visited the previous summer. "They might not fit perfectly," he apologized, "but they'll be better than what you've been wearing." While Grace washed away the grime of her ordeal, Russell prepared a simple meal in the kitchen. The aroma of coffee and frying bacon drew her like a magnet when she emerged, feeling somewhat restored in the borrowed dress. "Sit," he instructed, placing a plate before her. "You look like you haven't eaten in days." "Just since yesterday morning," she admitted, suddenly ravenous at the sight of food. Russell watched her eat for a moment before joining her at the table. "We need to talk about what happens next," he said quietly. "Wilkes isn't a man who gives up easily. If what you saw is enough to hang him, he'll stop at nothing to silence you." Grace set down her fork, appetite diminishing despite her hunger. "I know. I should probably leave the territory entirely, but I don't have the means." "Running isn't the answer," Russell said firmly. "Not yet, anyway. First, we need to get your testimony to the federal marshal in Helena." "But how?" "Wilkes has men watching all the roads." Russell leaned back in his chair, thoughtful. "I have a friend who works for the stage line. He could get a message to Marshal Davis without raising suspicion." "And until then?" "Until then, you stay here. I'll tell my hands that you're my cousin, come to help around the house after taking ill on your journey west. Most of them won't question it, and those who might know better can be trusted." Grace stared at him, unable to comprehend why this man she barely knew would risk so much for her. "Why are you helping me?" Russell's expression darkened. "2 years ago, Wilkes tried to force me to sell my water rights. When I refused, one of my hands was found beaten nearly to death. No one could prove Wilkes was behind it, but everyone knew. The man left the territory as soon as he could ride." He met her gaze directly. "I don't take kindly to bullies, Miss Reynolds." "Grace," she corrected him. "If I'm to be your cousin, you should call me by my first name." The corner of his mouth lifted slightly. "Grace," he repeated. "And I'm Russell, not Mr. Galloway, at least not from you." A connection seemed to form between them in that moment, a fragile thread of trust spun from shared adversity. Grace felt some of the crushing weight lift from her shoulders. She wasn't alone anymore. "Now," Russell said, rising from the table, "you need rest. A real bed this time, not a pile of hay." He showed her to a small bedroom that, while simple, seemed like the height of luxury after her night in the hayloft. Clean sheets, a soft pillow, and a door that locked from the inside. Grace nearly wept with gratitude. "Sleep as long as you need," Russell told her. "No one will disturb you here." When the door closed behind him, Grace sank onto the edge of the bed, overcome by the day's events. From terror to cautious hope in the span of hours, it was almost too much to process. She lay down, expecting sleep to elude her despite her exhaustion, but the moment her head touched the pillow, she drifted into a deep, dreamless slumber. She awoke to sunlight streaming through curtained windows. For a disorienting moment, she couldn't remember where she was or how she had gotten there. Then the events of the past 2 days rushed back, and she sat up quickly. A glance at the small clock on the bedside table showed it was past noon. She had slept for nearly 14 hours. Embarrassed by her prolonged rest, Grace quickly made the bed and changed back into the borrowed dress before venturing out of the bedroom. The house was quiet, but she could hear activity outside. Following the sounds, she discovered Russell in a workshop attached to the barn, repairing what appeared to be a broken wagon wheel. He looked up at her approach, setting aside his tools. "You're awake, feeling better?" "Much," Grace admitted. "Thank you again for your kindness." "You already thanked me," he reminded her with a slight smile. "Are you hungry?" "Mrs. Henley, my housekeeper, has left some food in the kitchen." "Starving," Grace confessed. They walked to the house together, Russell explaining the daily routines of the ranch as they went. Grace listened attentively, grateful for the normalcy of the conversation after the chaos of recent events. "I've sent a man I trust to Helena with a message for Marshal Davis," Russell informed her as they entered the kitchen. "With luck, he'll return with the marshal in 3 or 4 days." "And until then?" Grace asked, accepting the plate of cold chicken and bread he offered. "Until then, you're Grace Reynolds, my cousin from back east, recovering from a fever that delayed your journey." He poured her a cup of coffee. "If anyone asks, which they won't, you're here to help with household matters while considering whether to accept a teaching position in the fall." The story was simple enough to remember, close enough to the truth to be believable. Grace nodded her understanding. "I've told the same to Mrs. Henley, who comes in 3 times a week to cook and clean. She's discreet and won't pry." Russell hesitated, then added, "I haven't told her the full truth, just that you needed a place to stay after some trouble in town." "That's probably wise," Grace agreed. "The fewer people who know, the safer everyone will be." They settled into an unexpected routine over the next 2 days. Grace helped around the house, mending clothes and preparing meals when Mrs. Henley wasn't there. Russell went about his regular duties, running the ranch with quiet efficiency, but always making time to check on her throughout the day. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch if the weather allowed, or by the fireplace if it didn't, talking until late into the night. Grace learned that Russell had come west 10 years earlier, working as a ranch hand before saving enough to buy his own small spread. Through determination and hard work, he had built it into one of the most successful operations in the county. Russell, in turn, discovered that Grace had left her home in Boston after the death of her parents, seeking independence and purpose in the West. Her position as a schoolteacher had been her first taste of true freedom. "You regret coming west?" He asked her on the third evening as they watched the sun set from the porch. Grace considered the question seriously. "No," she said finally. "Despite everything, I don't. There's something about this land that gets under your skin, isn't there? A sense of possibility that doesn't exist back east." Russell nodded, understanding in his eyes. "That's exactly it. Out here, a person can become whoever they want to be, not just who they were born to be." Their conversations revealed a surprising alignment of values and perspectives. Both valued honesty, hard work, and fairness. Both loved literature, though Russell admitted sheepishly that he had little time for reading these days. Both felt a deep connection to the rugged beauty of Montana territory. On the fourth day, as they shared lunch in the kitchen, the sound of approaching riders drew their attention. Russell moved to the window, his posture tense until he recognized the newcomers. "It's Jacob returning with Marshall Davis," he told Grace, relief evident in his voice. "Wait here." Grace remained in the kitchen, heart pounding as she heard the men's voices outside, then boots on the porch steps. When Russell entered with two men behind him, she rose on shaky legs. The older of the two strangers stepped forward, removing his hat. "Miss Reynolds, I'm Federal Marshal Ethan Davis. I understand you witnessed something I should know about." His kind eyes and straightforward manner put Grace somewhat at ease. With Russell's encouraging nod, she recounted what she had seen at the saloon, how mine owner James Wilkes had argued with his partner, Harold Simmons, over account books that appeared to show embezzlement. How Wilkes had drawn his gun and shot Simmons point blank when the man threatened to go to the authorities. How Wilkes had seen her watching from across the room and ordered his men to get rid of her. Marshal Davis listened intently, occasionally making notes in a small book. When she finished, he asked several clarifying questions before tucking the book away. "Your testimony matches what we've suspected about Wilkes for some time," he said gravely, "but we've never had a witness brave enough to come forward. What happens now?" Russell asked, his hand coming to rest supportively on Grace's shoulder. "Ideally, Miss Reynolds would come with me to Helena to provide a formal deposition," the marshal replied, "but I'm concerned about her safety on the journey. Wilkes has men everywhere. Could the deposition be taken here?" Grace suggested. Marshal Davis exchanged glances with his deputy. "It's irregular but possible. I brought the necessary documents just in case." The formalities took several hours, with Grace signing multiple pages of testimony and the marshal witnessing her signature. By the time they finished, evening was approaching. "We'll ride out at first light," Marshal Davis announced. "I'll have a warrant for Wilkes's arrest by the time we reach Pine Ridge." "What about Miss Reynolds?" Russell asked. "She can't go back to town while Wilkes is still free." The marshal nodded grimly. "She should remain here until I send word that it's safe. Even then, she may want to consider relocating. Men like Wilkes have long memories and longer reach." The thought of leaving Pine Ridge, of leaving the life she had begun to build there, hit Grace harder than expected. She had grown fond of the small town and its people. And now, after these few days at the ranch, the idea of leaving Russell stirred a surprising ache in her chest. The marshal and his deputy stayed for dinner, sleeping in the bunkhouse before departing early the next morning. Their presence had provided a sense of official protection, and their departure left Grace feeling suddenly vulnerable again. "They'll arrest him," Russell assured her, seeming to sense her unease as they watched the lawman ride away. "Wilkes won't hurt anyone else." "I hope you're right," Grace replied softly. "But the marshal was right about one thing. I'll probably need to leave Pine Ridge when this is over." Russell turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Is that what you want?" "No," she admitted, "but I don't see what choice I have. Even with Wilkes behind bars, his friends and business associates won't forget my part in putting him there." "You could stay here," Russell said, the words coming out in a rush. "At least until things settle down. The ranch is remote enough that few would think to look for you here." Grace studied his face, trying to understand the offer. Was it merely an extension of his protection, or was there something more behind it? The intensity in his eyes suggested the latter, stirring feelings she hadn't expected to develop in such circumstances. "I couldn't impose on your hospitality indefinitely," she said carefully. It wouldn't be an imposition. Russell's voice dropped lower. These past few days, having you here, it's been. He seemed unable to find the right words, but Grace understood. The connection between them had grown stronger each day, conversations flowing more easily, silences becoming comfortable rather than awkward. She had begun to look forward to their evenings together, to the sound of his laughter, to the thoughtful insights he offered. "I know," she said softly. "I've felt it too." The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken possibilities. Then a shout from one of the ranch hands shattered the stillness, calling Russell's attention to a problem with the cattle in the south pasture. "We'll talk more later," he promised, reluctance clear in his eyes as he turned away, but later never came. Russell returned from the pasture to find an urgent message waiting from town. One of his hands had encountered a friend who reported that Wilkes was gathering men, having somehow learned that Grace was hiding at the Galloway ranch. How could he know? Grace asked, fear clawing at her throat as Russell relayed the news. Someone must have seen the marshal arrive or overheard something in town. Russell's jaw was tight with tension. It doesn't matter now. What matters is getting you somewhere safe before they come. Where, if they know I'm here, they'll watch the roads. Russell paced the kitchen, thinking rapidly. There's a line shack about 10 miles into the hills. It's primitive but sheltered and hard to find if you don't know it's there. I could get you there before dark. Grace nodded, trusting his judgment. How long would I need to stay? Just until we hear that Wilkes has been arrested. A few days at most. He met her eyes directly. I won't let anything happen to you, Grace, I promise. The sincerity in his voice steadied her. I know you won't. They packed quickly food, water, blankets, a rifle. Russell saddled 2 horses, including his most sure-footed mare for Grace to ride. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, they set out, taking a winding path through dense forest to mask their trail. The lined shack was indeed primitive, a single room with a small stove, rough-hewn table, and narrow cot, but it was solid and well hidden among the pines, with a spring nearby providing fresh water. It's not much, Russell apologized as he lit the lantern hanging from a beam. It's perfect, Grace assured him. After the hayloft, and with the threat of Wilkes's men looming, the simple shelter seemed like a fortress. Russell built a small fire in the stove to ward off the evening chill, then checked and rechecked the supplies he'd brought. His reluctance to leave was obvious, but they both knew he needed to return to the ranch to avoid raising suspicion about their whereabouts. I'll come back tomorrow with more supplies, he promised, lingering at the door. Keep the rifle close just in case, but I don't think anyone will find you here. I'll be fine, Grace said with more confidence than she felt. Go, before it gets too dark, to see your way back. Russell hesitated, then stepped closer, one hand coming up to gently touch her cheek. Grace, he stopped, seemingly at a loss for words, heart pounding. Grace covered his hand with her own. I know, she whispered. Me too. The admission hung in the air between them. Then Russell leaned down, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that started gentle but quickly deepened with shared emotion. Grace's arms wound around his neck, drawing him closer as months of loneliness and days of fear gave way to this unexpected connection. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. Russell rested his forehead against hers, eyes closed as if committing the moment to memory. I have to go, he murmured regretfully. Come back safely, Grace replied, releasing him reluctantly. With one last lingering look, Russell left, the sound of his horses' hooves fading into the gathering darkness. Grace secured the door behind him, then moved to the small window, watching until even the shadow of his presence had vanished among the trees. Alone in the quiet of the lined shack, she replayed the kiss in her mind, marveling at how natural it had felt, how right. In just a few days, Russell Galloway had become more important to her than she could have imagined possible. The realization both thrilled and terrified her. The night passed slowly. Grace dozed fitfully on the cot, waking at every sound from the forest outside. By dawn, she was exhausted but alert, watching through the window for Russell's return. Morning stretched into afternoon with no sign of him. Grace tried to quell her rising anxiety, telling herself that he had many responsibilities at the ranch, that perhaps it wasn't safe yet for him to make the journey to the shack. As the sun began to set, however, her worry deepened into fear. Something was wrong. Russell wouldn't have left her alone for so long unless something had prevented his return. Wilkes. The name burned in her mind like a brand. Had his men found the ranch? Had they threatened Russell, or worse? Grace paced the small confines of the shack, debating her options. She could stay put, as Russell had instructed, but for how long? She had food for another day, maybe two if she rationed carefully. She could try to make her way back to the ranch, but if Wilkes's men were there, she would be walking directly into danger. As darkness fell, she made her decision. She couldn't stay here indefinitely, and she couldn't bear not knowing what had happened to Russell. At first light, she would return to the ranch, approaching cautiously to assess the situation before making her presence known. The night seemed endless. Grace cleaned the rifle as Russell had shown her, prepared a small pack of essentials, and tried unsuccessfully to rest. When the first pale light of dawn filtered through the trees, she was ready. The ride back to the ranch was tense, every snapping twig or rustling leaf setting her nerves on edge. She approached from the north, using the cover of the forest to mask her approach. When the buildings came into view, she reined in her horse, observing from a distance. The ranch appeared quiet, almost too quiet. No hands moved between the buildings, no smoke rose from the bunkhouse chimney. Something was definitely wrong. Grace dismounted, securing her horse to a tree before continuing on foot. She kept to the edge of the forest, moving slowly until she reached a position where she could see the main house clearly. Her heart sank at the sight of unfamiliar horses tied at the hitching post. A movement caught her eye, a man emerging from the barn, rifle in hand. She recognized him immediately as one of the Blackburn brothers who had searched the barn that first night. Wilkes's men had indeed come to the ranch, and they were still there, which meant Russell. Grace refused to complete the thought. She needed to see inside the house to know what was happening. Moving with as much stealth as she could manage, she circled to the back of the property, using outbuildings for cover. The kitchen door stood slightly ajar. Grace approached cautiously, ears straining for any sound from within. A low murmur of voices reached her men talking in the front room of the house. Among them, she recognized Russell's deeper tones, relief flooding through her at the evidence that he was alive. Gathering her courage, Grace eased the door open and slipped inside. The kitchen was empty, but she could hear more clearly now. "Waste of time," someone was saying. "She's long gone by now." "She's not gone," another voice responded harshly. "Galloway hid her somewhere, and he's going to tell us where, or things are going to get a lot more unpleasant for him." The sound of a blow followed, then a grunt of pain that had to have come from Russell. Grace's hands tightened around the rifle she carried. 4 against 1, those weren't odds she liked, but she couldn't leave Russell at their mercy. Moving silently through the kitchen, she positioned herself where she could see into the front room without being seen. The scene confirmed her worst fears. Russell was tied to a chair in the center of the room, face bruised and bloody. 4 men surrounded him, including both Blackburn brothers and a tall, elegantly dressed figure she recognized as James Wilkes himself. "This is your last chance, Galloway," Wilkes was saying, his cultured voice at odds with the cruelty in his eyes. "Where is the girl?" Russell spat blood onto the floorboards. "Go to hell, Wilkes," Wilkes sighed theatrically. "Such heroics, quite wasted, I'm afraid. The marshal never reached town. My men intercepted him on the road. No one is coming to save either of you." Grace's blood ran cold at the revelation. If Wilkes had stopped the marshal, there would be no arrest, no justice. She and Russell were truly on their own. One of the Blackburns raised his pistol, pressing it to Russell's temple. "Boss says this is your last chance. Where'd you hide her?" Russell's eyes, despite the pain evident in them, remained defiant. "She's somewhere you'll never find her." Wrong answer. The man cocked the hammer of his pistol. Grace acted without conscious thought. Stepping into the doorway, she raised her rifle. "Let him go," she commanded, her voice steadier than she felt. All heads turned toward her, expressions ranging from surprise to triumph. Wilkes recovered first, a smile spreading across his face that didn't reach his eyes. "Miss Reynolds. How kind of you to join us and save us the trouble of hunting you down." "Grace, run," Russell shouted, struggling against his bonds. "I'm not leaving you," she replied, keeping her rifle trained on Wilkes. "Tell your men to drop their weapons, Mr. Wilkes, or I'll shoot you where you stand." Wilkes chuckled, unimpressed by her threat. "You won't get all of us before one of us gets you, my dear. Why not be sensible? Put down the rifle, and perhaps I'll consider being merciful." "Like you were merciful to Harold Simmons," Grace countered. "I saw you murder him in cold blood." "I signed a deposition detailing exactly what I witnessed. Even if you killed the marshal, there are copies of my testimony. Killing me won't change that." Doubt flickered across Wilkes's face for the first time. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" Marshal Davis was very thorough. Copies were sent to the territorial governor and to federal authorities in Washington. This was a lie, but Grace delivered it with convincing certainty. "You're finished, Mr. Wilkes, whether I live or die." Wilkes's composure slipped further. "Blackburn, check if she's telling the truth. Search the house for any papers." As one of the brothers moved toward the study, a new voice called from outside. "Federal Marshal, the house is surrounded. Come out with your hands up." Hope surged through Grace. Had the marshal escaped Wilkes's men after all? Confusion and alarm spread across the faces of Wilkes and his henchmen. The momentary distraction was all Russell needed. With a powerful thrust, he tipped his chair backward, sending himself crashing to the floor. In the commotion, Grace fired a shot into the ceiling, adding to the chaos. The front door burst open, and armed men poured in, not marshals. Grace realized with dismay, but Russell's ranch hands, led by his foreman. They had created the diversion on their own initiative, gambling that it would work. It did. In the ensuing struggle, Wilkes and one of the Blackburns were subdued, though the other two managed to escape through a window. Grace rushed to Russell's side, untying his bonds with trembling fingers. "Are you badly hurt?" she asked, helping him to sit up. "I've had worse from breaking horses," he assured her, though the effort it took him to stand suggested otherwise. His eyes searched her face anxiously. "When you didn't come back to the shack, I thought they'd found you." "I couldn't stay there not knowing if you were safe," she explained, supporting him with an arm around his waist. Russell's foreman approached, expression grim. "We've got these two secured, boss. Jackson and Peters are riding for the sheriff in Pine Ridge." "What about the marshal?" Grace asked. "Wilkes said his men intercepted him." "Delayed him, more likely," Russell said. "If they'd killed a federal marshal, Wilkes wouldn't have been wasting time questioning me about your whereabouts. He'd have been running for the territorial border." His assessment proved correct. The next day, Marshal Davis arrived with a contingent of deputies and the sheriff from Pine Ridge. He had indeed been delayed by an ambush, but had escaped with only minor injuries. The men who had fled the ranch were captured attempting to leave the territory. Wilkes and his accomplices were taken into custody, charged with murder, attempted murder, and a host of other crimes. With Grace's testimony and the additional evidence the marshal had gathered, their conviction seemed certain. In the aftermath, Grace found herself at a crossroads. The school board in Pine Ridge, impressed by her courage, offered to reinstate her position for the fall term. Several other communities, having heard of her ordeal, extended similar offers. A week after Wilkes's arrest, Grace sat with Russell on the porch of his ranch house, watching the sunset as they had before everything had changed. "Have you decided?" he asked quietly, knowing she had been considering the various teaching positions. Grace nodded slowly. "I have. I'm staying in Pine Ridge." Relief washed over Russell's features. "I'm glad. The town needs a good teacher." "That's not the only reason I'm staying," Grace admitted, turning to face him fully. "The truth is, I can't imagine being anywhere else now, not after everything that's happened, not after." Russell reached for her hand, his calloused fingers entwining with hers. "I was hoping you'd say that. These past weeks, having you here even under such terrible circumstances made me realize how empty this place was before, how empty my life was." The tenderness in his eyes took her breath away. "What are you saying, Russell?" I'm saying that I love you, Grace Reynolds, that I think I started falling in love with you the moment I found you hiding in my hayloft." He squeezed her hand gently. "I'm saying that I want you to stay, not just in Pine Ridge, but here with me, if you'll have me." Joy bloomed in Grace's chest, bright and warm as the setting sun. "I love you too," she whispered. "I never expected to find love while running for my life, but somehow I did." Russell smiled, lifting her hand to his lips. "Is that a yes?" "It's a yes," Grace confirmed, laughing softly as he pulled her into his arms. Their kiss was a promise, a beginning. When they finally parted, Russell rested his forehead against hers, his expression serious despite the happiness in his eyes. "It won't always be easy," he warned. "Ranch life is hard, and people might talk about how quickly this happened between us." "Let them talk," Grace said firmly. "We know what we've been through together, what we've found in each other. That's all that matters." 3 months later, they were married in a simple ceremony at the ranch, surrounded by friends who had stood by them through the ordeal. The marshal came from Helena to attend, bringing news that James Wilkes had been sentenced to hang for his crimes. After the guests departed, Russell led Grace to the barn, a mischievous smile playing at his lips. "Where are we going?" she asked, curious. "I have something to show you," he replied mysteriously. They climbed to the hayloft, now neat and swept, with a lantern hanging from a beam casting a warm glow over the space. In the corner where Grace had hidden that fateful night, Russell had placed a small wooden plaque on the wall. Grace moved closer to read the inscription. "Here began the greatest adventure of our lives." Tears filled her eyes as she turned to her husband. "It's perfect." "I thought we should commemorate the spot," Russell said, drawing her into his arms. "After all, if you hadn't chosen my barn to hide in that night, we might never have found each other." "I think we would have," Grace countered softly. "Some things are just meant to be." As they stood there in the hayloft where their story had begun, Grace reflected on the strange and winding path that had brought her to this moment. From terror to love, from hiding to belonging, her journey had been unexpected in every way. Yet standing in the circle of Russell's arms, she knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Years passed, and the Galloway ranch prospered under Russell's capable management. Grace divided her time between teaching at the growing school in Pine Ridge and helping with the ranch, finding fulfillment in both roles. Their first child, a daughter they named Eleanor, arrived a year after their marriage, followed 2 years later by a son, Samuel. The hayloft became a special place for their family, the spot where Russell would tell the children stories on rainy afternoons, where Grace would sometimes retreat with a book when she needed a moment of quiet, where they would gather on the anniversary of that fateful night to remember how their love story began. On one such anniversary, 10 years after Grace had first hidden among the hay, Russell found her there alone, lost in thought as she traced the words on the plaque with her fingertips. "Penny for your thoughts," he asked, climbing up to join her. Grace smiled, making room for him beside her. "I was just thinking about how different my life would have been if I hadn't witnessed that murder, if I hadn't run here, if you hadn't found me that night." Russell took her hand, his touch as reassuring now as it had been a decade ago. "Do you ever regret it?" "Not the danger, of course, but choosing this life instead of returning east or moving on to another town." "Never," Grace said without hesitation. "Not for a single moment. This ranch, our children, this is the life I was always meant to have, even if I didn't know it until I was hiding in your hayloft, terrified and alone." "You weren't alone for long," Russell reminded her, his voice soft with memory, "and you never will be again." He leaned in to kiss her, the same spark passing between them that had ignited in this very spot so many years before. When they parted, Grace rested her head on his shoulder, content in the knowledge that sometimes the darkest nights could lead to the brightest dawns. Outside, their children called for them, eager for the celebration dinner that had become tradition on this day. Russell helped Grace to her feet, and together they descended the ladder, leaving the hayloft to its memories as they moved forward into the continuing story of their lives together, a story that had begun with fear and desperation, but had blossomed into a love as vast and enduring as the Montana sky.